This lecture will augment the textbook reading for this module, but it's not designed to review the reading directly or in entirety, or to supplant your own study of the assigned reading. Some of the material in this presentation will build upon concepts and terminology introduced in the Steinberg introduction section of the text, while other concepts may be covered elsewhere in the text or not at all. Throughout this online course, I'm going to try to assist you through the lectures in reinforcing the major concepts, theories, and applications introduced in the readings. As you read independently, think about what you think are the main ideas and supporting details in the chapter and try to clarify them on your own. If you do this before watching the lecture, you'll learn more in the end. So let's begin by learning about some of the major theories and theorists in the study of adolescence and some important terminology. We can think of adolescence as roughly the second decade of life. This period is defined by the transitions that occur, including biological, cognitive, psychological, social, and economic transitions. So, adolescence is a series of transitions from immaturity to maturity, or from childhood to adulthood. The boundaries of adolescence and the extent to which there is an abrupt or gradual transition from childhood to adulthood depends upon the nature of the culture in which one lives, and we'll learn more about this from the perspectives of Margaret Mead, who is a cultural anthropologist. Now, the word adolescence derives from the Latin adolescere, which means to grow into adulthood. So we learned that adolescence corresponds roughly to the second decade of life, but there is no universally accepted way to define the boundaries of adolescence. We can divide the period, as Steinberg does, into 3 stages. And you'll notice that these correspond approximately to the ages of adolescence in middle or junior high school, and college. So early adolescence is roughly the ages between 10 and 13. That's equivalent to middle school or junior high. Middle adolescence, ages 14 to 17, is typically high school age. And late adolescence, ages 18 to 21, is typically college age. Now, another term that has similar connotations, but really is different in terms of its definition, is that of a teenager. This is an individual who is between 13 and 19 years of age, and you can see that this period encompasses only part of the second decade of life. This term first appeared in print in 1941, and social historians believe that the term emerged as a result of the Great Depression, when economics and the need for employment of adults misplaced youngsters from the workplace. They then had more time on their hands. A new view of teenagers emerged, as evident in film and literature, of teens as irresponsible and undependable. And to a great extent, this negative stereotype has persisted through to current times. One school of thought on the study of adolescence is that adolescence is a social invention, and therefore the boundary between childhood and adolescence is artificial. In other words, it is a social construct that has been invented by society. Inventionists argued that puberty has always existed, though adolescence is a contemporary construct. They believe that adolescence arose as a result of political, social, and economic changes within our society. So, inventionists point out that prior to the Industrial Revolution, the primarily agricultural society of the United States viewed children as miniature adults, and it wasn't until they owned property that they became viewed as adults. With industrialization, it became more important for youth to learn career skills that couldn't be handed down from their parents. Parents then encouraged their children to focus more on school in order to succeed. And ultimately, youths were more likely then to spend their day with peers or age mates. Now, this concept of the teenage years as tumultuous actually goes back to a much earlier time. And this quote from Jean-Jacques Rousseau is illustrative of the concept. As the roaring of the waves precedes the tempest, so the murmur of rising passions announces the tumultuous change. Keep your hand upon the helm, or all is lost. This was written by Rousseau in 1762 and published again in 1911. We're going to take a close look at the main ideas of several theorists who are known for their work in adolescence. First of all, G. Stanley Hall, who's known as the father of adolescence; Margaret Mead, a famous anthropologist; Erik Erikson, who's known for his study of personality and identity; James Marcia, who extended Erikson's work in identity development; Lawrence Kohlberg, who's known for his work on moral development; and Carol Gilligan, who studied gender differences. G. Stanley Hall is credited with inventing the term of adolescence. His seminal 1904 book first coined this term, and he believed that adolescence entails inevitable storm and stress. And in German, this is written as Sturm and Drang. So this Sturm and Drang, or storm and stress, he believed is universal. In other words, everyone who enters the period of adolescence will experience Sturm and Drang. And he felt that this period was brought about by biological changes. So this is referred to as biological determinism. He also believed that young people were growing up too quickly. And he said, quote, "Youth awakes to a new world and understands neither it nor himself," unquote. Now let's look at the work of Margaret Mead. You see on the right the book cover of one of her most well-known books, The Coming of Age in Samoa. This was written in 1928. It became a bestseller and it's been translated into many languages. And this work presented the idea for the first time that the individual experience of developmental stages could be shaped by cultural demands and expectations. So, Margaret Mead was a foremost anthropologist, and she spent 3 years observing girls in Samoa. And she advanced the idea of cultural determinism. So contrast that to what we heard just a moment ago about biological determinism and G. Stanley Hall. So she took an opposite point of view. And she said that the extent to which adolescence might be more or less stormy and sexual development more or less problematic differed from one culture to another. So she thought that human behavior could be explained exclusively in cultural terms. She landed in Samoa in 1925, and she did what we call ethnographic observations, in other words, observing and studying phenomena within the environment. And what she found is that in studying these 50 adolescent girls in the primitive Taus society of Samoa, that here adolescence was a relatively untroubled period because society changed very little from one generation to the other. Adolescence in Samoa was essentially a smooth, happy, and untroubled time. So she was really the first anthropologist to look at human development in a cross-cultural perspective. Altogether, she wrote 44 books and 1,000 articles on cultural anthropology, making her the foremost anthropologist in the world. Now, she also proposed some terminology, a particular conceptualization of different kinds of cultures, 3 particular kinds of cultures: post-figurative, co-figurative, and prefigurative. And here the prefixes are significant. Post refers to the past, co the present, and pre refers to the future. So in post-figurative culture, also known as a folk society or pre-industrialized society, children grow up in a world that is modeled much like the past. So what they experience is quite similar to the world that their parents experienced in the previous generation. In this culture, values and traditions are transmitted from the elders down to the young. Now, in a co-figurative culture or industrial society, culture is modeled after the present world. And here, the influences of parents and children are reciprocal. So, children learn from their parents values and ideas, and parents also learn from their children. So, it's a reciprocal exchange of values and culture. Now, in prefigurative society, which is more like what we experience here in the United States and in other developed nations of the world, culture is rapidly changing, and often the children teach their elders their values and skills. Our present technological society has many elements of prefigurative culture. Think about digital natives, and maybe you are a digital native, having grown up in an age when computers were prevalent. In that sense, you may be teaching your elders a lot about technology. Another important theorist is Erik Erikson, and he's known for his work in personality theory. This is one of the books that relates to our particular area of study, Identity, Youth, and Crisis, which was published in 1968. So he was a personality theorist. He was trained at Vienna Psychological Institute. He also taught at Harvard, and he did clinical work in Western Massachusetts. He talked about a crisis as a necessary turning point, a crucial moment when development must move one way or another. And so he thought that each stage of development across the lifespan had a particular crisis. And the crisis for adolescence is identity. So this is the normative crisis in adolescence and young adulthood. Now, that doesn't mean that one doesn't develop identity before adolescence. The process of identity formation begins with the first interactions of mother and child. But he believed that identity crisis was really consolidated during the period of adolescence. Identity, though, is constantly changing. It's never achieved in any static or unchangeable sense. He believed that there are at least 3 reasons why adolescents begin to ask the question, who am I, during this period. First, you have the changes in puberty. So as students, children, or adolescents are noticing the changes in their bodies, the physical and sexual changes, they begin to question their identity and try to understand where they fit into the spectrum of child to adult. Second, adolescents have newly emergent abilities to think about complex issues, such as one's identity. So they're better able to do abstract thinking and hypothetical reasoning. And finally, family and societal pressures and responsibilities push the youth toward increasing self-definition. So for Erikson, adolescence is the time to develop an initial identity status in many aspects of life. For example, political views, religious, educational, vocational. And failure to achieve an identity resulted in personal confusion, or what we call a diffused identity, and a lack of direction. A little bit about how he derived these theories. He conducted clinical and cross-cultural observations of youth at various stages of development. And ultimately, he identified a series of 8 psychosocial crises. And he believed that the development of identity was the chief psychosocial crisis of adolescence. Let's look at these 8 stages of development and psychosocial crises in sequence. You can learn more about each particular stage by reading in your text, but Notice that in infancy, the basic conflict is gaining trust versus mistrust. So if the child is comforted when they need support and cared for and fed and changed, then the child develops trust in parents, and that ultimately transmits to trust in others. In early childhood, the idea is developing autonomy and independence versus shame or doubt in one's own abilities. So across the various age spans, we have different normative crises. These are points at which the individual must grapple with a particular crisis in order to move forward and achieve some resolution. So it was achieving identity versus identity diffusion that is the major psychosocial crisis of adolescence. So the successful resolution of a crisis is dependent on the successful resolution of a preceding crisis. So theoretically, if one didn't gain trust in infancy, their psychosocial development would be hampered throughout life. Erikson also believed that during adolescence, in order to fully achieve identity, that the individual needs a period of psychosocial moratorium. And Muse defined this as a period of delay that's needed for individuals to meet obligations and make commitments. So it would be a time of reduced responsibilities, and it would allow the individual to probe his or her own belief systems and goals and achieve identity. Now, of course, that's not always possible and really not ever entirely feasible, but it is an important time for self-exploration. So, again, he thought that identity development was not possible until this stage of cognition, until the youngster is able to think in abstract terms. It involves determining one's place in society, and one's identity is shaped by interactions with others. So in school, we learn by how the teacher responds to us about our own capabilities. We learn how our peers interact with us, and that teaches us about our social standing. So our parents, our family, our peers, and even strangers shape our sense of identity constantly throughout life. Now, James Marcia was known for his work in identity, and he extended this work of Erikson and identified 4 possible results of this exploration. He said that identity achievement was determined by the opportunity for a moratorium in which individuals could explore possible values and belief systems and goals, and then commit to those that are most well suited. And if this did not occur, then the individual might develop identity diffusion, or in other words, more accurately, I should probably say that they would fail to develop identity. So they would have a diffuse sense of identity. You may know people who have a sort of incoherent, disjointed, incomplete sense of self, even as adults. All adolescents do not successfully achieve a strong sense of identity. So these are people who are always, trying to seem instead of be who they are, or trying out new things. They're kind of like a chameleon. And so this would be a problem of identity diffusion. Another less desirable outcome is identity foreclosure. In other words, the individual who fails to consider a wide range of options and just maybe takes on the beliefs and values of their parents without much exploration. So they commit, but they don't explore. This would be identity foreclosure. And then moratorium refers to an acute stage of crisis that is required in order to promote reflection. So one could actually become stuck in the stage of moratorium. Now, looking at these possibilities in terms of a grid, we see that there are 2 factors that will determine how one's identity develops. The first is commitment. So is the individual able to make a commitment to a particular sense of identity? And then the other side of the spectrum is, not spectrum, but dichotomy, is crisis exploration. Do they have a crisis, and do they explore options? So if one does not experience crisis and exploration or commitment, this would result in a diffused identity. If they experience no crisis or exploration but do commit, this would be foreclosed identity. If they experience crisis and exploration but fail to commit, they're in still moratorium. And if they experience crisis and explore and then commit to a sense of identity, this would constitute the desirable outcome of identity achievement. Next, we'd like to explore briefly the work of Lawrence Kohlberg, who is known for his levels of moral development. He said that a moral judgment is the concept of moral judgment is the ability to evaluate right or wrong in a hypothetical situation. So he evaluated levels of moral development with these sort of hypothetical dilemmas, problems that he asked individuals to respond to. And he distinguished this from moral behavior, and that's the likelihood of acting morally in a real-life situation. So that's the application of the moral judgment. Just because one is able to make moral judgment does not necessarily mean that they will behave morally. And he identified 3 broad stages of moral development: the pre-conventional or pre-moral level, the conventional or moral level, and the post-conventional or autonomous level. Each one of these levels has, or these 3 basic levels, has 2 sub-levels. Let's look at pre-conventional or pre-moral reasoning. This is most prevalent during childhood. As Muse explained, it's concerned with external concrete consequences of an act to the self. So it's basically, will I get caught is what determines whether or not one would do something wrong. At stage 1, it's the obedience and punishment orientation. They simply want to avoid punishment and they want to receive gratification. Stage 2 is labeled individualism, instrumentalism, and exchange. So this is the period of moral relativism. And individuals may manipulate their behavior in order to receive awards, or they may participate in reciprocity. You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. The next level is conventional or the moral level. And here there's a concern for external social expectations. And so acceptance of the existing social order or rules and norms are becoming more important. And they recognize that others have rights and they conform to social expectations. Stage 3 is the good boy, good girl stage. So they become conscious of others, or more sociocentric. They would observe the good golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. They want to live up to expectations of others and win approval. And then stage 4 is law and order. So there's a belief in law, order, duty, and legitimate authority. And a belief in concrete principles of justice, what's a sense of fairness. Level 3 is the post-conventional or autonomous level. Autonomy relates to independence. So this is these are self-chosen moral principles. Universal principles of justice. So moral reasoning and moral behavior are going to be more consistent, more likely to behave in ways that are consistent with our high moral principles. So stage 5 is the social contract, based on fundamental principles, concern for welfare of the community at large, and the belief that laws should serve human rights. And finally, the highest level, and one which very few individuals ever really achieve, is principled conscience. This is the highest level of moral reasoning, and there's an emphasis on self-chosen values. They place the highest value on human life, equality, and dignity. And finally, this is just a brief explanation to Carol Gilligan, and I know I'm covering a lot, and it's not necessary for you to have complete mastery of all these concepts. I'm just trying to put them in your head and get you thinking about them in a broad sense, and later on we'll go back and probe them more deeply. And of course, if you wanted to go sort any of this out, you could refer to the textbook for a little bit more in-depth explanation. So Carol Gilligan was known for her work in gender differences. And so she developed a new conceptualization of women's moral judgment. She felt that women made moral judgments differently than men. She felt that males and females approach moral dilemmas from different perspectives. Females base their perspectives more on caring, whereas males tend to base their decisions more on justice. So, Gilligan proposed that that females are more oriented toward interpersonal connectedness, and females base their morality on care, sensitivity, and responsibility to people rather than on abstract principles of justice. And she believed that the male voice advocates equality, reciprocity, autonomy, and individuation. In short, this represents the justice orientation. Now, I'd like to point out then that since Carol Gilligan did her seminal work, there have been a lot of follow-up studies that would sort of challenge these assertions, and so it's really not quite as simple, and there may be many different factors, and we may not be able to separate males and females so concretely in terms of their moral reasoning. I wanted to just point out these are the references from which I drew information, and our text, Adolescence, is a principal source of information, but I referred to many other documents and materials as well. This is the end of our introduction to adolescence.